Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to What is the Value of Attention, which is the first of our Constellations Assemblies 2023, curated by UP Projects in partnership with Flattime House and in association with Liverpool Biennial. I am Elizabeth Del Prete, the Senior Curator of Learning and Live Research at UP Projects. I'm a white woman with long, curly brown hair. I'm wearing a black top and silver earrings and a necklace. My pronouns are she, her. I'm very excited that today's event will be moderated by Nilika Jayawardene, who is Associate Professor of English at the State University of New York, Oswego, and also Research Associate at the Visual Identities in Art and Design at the University of Johannesburg. Nilika will be joined by Ahmet Algut, an artist based and working in Amsterdam, Istanbul, and Berlin, and by Magdalena Malm, curator and advisor in organizational development based in Sweden. All the biographies of our speakers are available on the link, which we will shortly post in the chat. So before I hand over to them, I would like to very quickly run through some virtual housekeeping. So if you experience any technical issues, please use the chat button at the bottom of your screen to chat privately with our dedicated tech support. Also, if you would like to ask our speakers any questions during the event, you can submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and they will get answered. And then just to note that the speakers will only be picking up questions from the Q&A and not from the chat. And finally, if you'd like to access closed captions, please select the CC button at the bottom of your screen to read along. We will be recording the event today, and I really hope you enjoy the discussion. Now, I'm very pleased to hand over to Nilika to kick off the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth, and thank you for inviting me. I'm thrilled to learn about UP Projects and about the work you do. Today, I'm going to start with showing you some works by another artist, and I'll share the screen so that hopefully you'll be able to see it. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let's see. Okay. So recently, I've been engaging with the work of the South African artist Thenjiwe Nikki Nkosi. Nkosi's practice often focuses on exploring, quote, the limits and capabilities of our human bodies. Her new works also question the ways in which, quote, structures of power use athletes and sports events like the Commonwealth Games, the Olympics, or even a local competition to legitimize and consolidate themselves. She helps us question what are the ways in which the public spectacle of the Commonwealth Games in particular, in creating a romantic notion of a family of nations tied together not by blood relations, but through being former colonies of Britain, reinforce violent extractive relations through symbolic and ceremonial repetition, restatement, and refrain. So one of the things that she does is show audiences as well. And in considering that relationship of the spectators to the spectacle, she reveals the ways in which acts of collective witnessing, audiences' support of particular athletes' teams or the nations they represent, become absorbed into the spectacle. Thereby, much like the athletes, they are corralled, if unconsciously, into furthering the political and economic agendas that are part of sport and sporting events. A year before the 2022 Commonwealth Games, Nkosi was invited by Eastside Projects, a Birmingham-based public art organization, to contribute artwork to the festival. Watching archival footage of the Commonwealth Games, particularly from the mid-20th century, Nkosi realized that she wanted to create what she wanted to create would rely on select clips of footage from the Commonwealth Games, the athletes, the spectators, the administrators. She would cut these clips together with images of economic and promotional activity in various British colonies and Commonwealth states. Here, archival footage isn't used as a means of representation, but as an intervention in history, in perspective, and as a way of revealing, quote, the structure of the Commonwealth and of the Games, and how they both work to uphold the structures of British imperialism. As the footage unspools complex threads of narrative, it reveals methodologies used to maintain those unequal relations, even as these methodologies are veiled by ceremony, pomp, and spectacle. And because these structures are purposefully concealed through the spectacle of sport, the drama of competition, wherein athletes are the tool used by the conjurer's sleight of hand, she decided to remove the athletes from the visual field in order to, quote, lay bare the economic and political relationships, as well as the imbalances in power between the formerly colonized and the former colonizer, which Britain continues to engineer to its advantage. What appears, once the film footage of the runners on the track are digitally removed, are fleeting traces of empire, repeating and replicating its practices. So I'm going to show you a very short clip of the film. Are you able to see the screen now? Yes?
Yes.
Great, okay. So I'd encourage you all to try to watch it sometime. In any case, it's then when one realizes drawing attention to something can be part of the sleight of hand that powerful structures use to draw attention away from less palatable things: structural violence of nation states, internal violence of the art institutions themselves, etc. Without the sleight of hand created by ceremony, pomp, celebration, the violent processes will be laid bare. They may not be able to continue in the same way. So as you might guess, I'm not a fan of attention or the use of drawing attention or raising awareness through artwork to draw audience eyeballs towards issues, not as a solution. Rather, I'm thinking about the following questions. What is the value of creating or directing attention towards something or an issue? Is, quote, raising awareness enough to open up processes of meaningful engagement from artists, art practitioners, and audiences? How might we go from being, quote, aware of something to activating that attention and awareness, rather than remain as passive viewers who sit stultified in shock and shamed by their relative freedoms and privileges? How might we move away from extractive processes that mine the pain of others who rarely benefit from such work and rarely attend such events or engage with artworks claiming to draw attention to their plight or their challenges? So yes, the conversation does not have to stop at, quote, we've drawn attention to X. Rather, we might try to imagine a more responsible way of engaging with the world, with others, with ourselves. As our speakers suggest through their work, there may be more productive ways that artists, art workers, and institutions may engage fully in a way that activates attention. So we will move on to speaking with our two speakers for today.
Yes, I guess that's me. I'm Magdalena Malm. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good. my background is as a curator, and I started working in the Swedish exchange program with studios, Jaspis, where I watched very closely how artists were working, and that kind of informed my practice. In 2007, I started a project called MAP, Mobile Art Production, where I wanted to rethink how an art institution is built in order to do other kinds of works that are usually really hard for either a theatre institution or an art platform or gallery to harbor. So I'm going to show quickly one of those projects. There is sharing, and then just 1 second here. So this was MAP, and this project is called Chopin's Heart by the performance collective Poste Restante. This was probably in 2011 or something like that. It was co-produced with Poland, so it was first shown in Warsaw and then in Stockholm. And Chopin's Heart is a place for melancholia, which you can't be cured, but it can be soothed or eased. So this is Danuta, and she can tuck you in with an electric blanket in one of those beds to give you a rest. Or here you can write a letter that you always wanted to write. In another place, there is a glory hole where you could anonymously hold someone's hand for comfort. You could also have a sangria in the sunset and have a dance cheek to cheek with a person in there. So there was a very, very intimate experience, and the interaction with the actors was also very, very one-to-one, personal, improvised, based on your own needs and wants. And I mean, you can see in the aesthetics, there's a play here with self-care and so on, but it's also pointing out there is something political in that we are not allowed to feel melancholia, or that where is the space of our imaginations, not only as a consumer product. So how do we take care of that? So there is this enormous attention to each viewer in this piece. And as a curator, I think suddenly you realize what you're doing or what things drives you. And I think when I made this project, I also realized that what I value as a curator, which I also value as a viewer, is presence. This feeling of heightened presence in the everyday, where you become in contact with yourself, but also with others. So this is something that I was investigating in a lot of projects, and then often ending up in between performance and art. Also because here you can't have a theater stage, and you can't also have a gallery space, because those are impossible places to show this work. So we always found a specific space for each work. And this aspect of care, attention, is something that I've brought with me with working in public space, and now more even in urban planning processes. Thank you.
Ahmed?
Hello, everybody. Hi. My name is Ahmet Öğüt. Very honored to be part of this panel discussion today and to do a very short presentation today. My pronouns are he, him. And I'm an artist based in Amsterdam, Berlin, and Istanbul. I do a lot of site-specific projects, commissioned projects. I've been traveling quite many years now and did a lot of projects pretty much world, but some of them are different than others. So today I'm going to present you 2 examples that are key to my practice as well. And they're also, at least the first platform I will show you is the long-term engagement example, which I would like to give, because I also have projects that they last short-term. They fit in the exhibition frameworks and residency frameworks and short-term frameworks within the art institutional structures and practices, but they're also things that I engage, like the school I will be introducing now, that's beyond pre-existing institutional structure within the artistic and educational practices, instituting practices. I'm going to screen share 1 second. All right. You see the slides?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So I would like to start with in this tiny presentation. It's very hard to explain a platform which was initiated first in 2012, and now it's more than a decade. But I will give you a little bit highlights about this platform and maybe one more example just to have diversity within my presentation. Silent University has been a platform for undocumented displaced migrants with academic backgrounds. Here you can see our principles translated in multiple languages, and principles since the beginning are at the core of the idea. So we had practical principles and ideological principles. And the idea was not only to work with art institutions, art museums, but also combine with academies, but also NGOs and other type of organizations, and kind of bring every institution's limited capacity together to create an unlimited options of, for a parasitic organization and platform like Silent University. Here you can see some images of our latest events in Istanbul. We have had branches in multiple cities. It first started in London in collaboration with Tate Modern and Delfina Foundation, and later with Showroom. And then that lasted a few years as an active branch in London. And here you can see the coordinators who later, a few years later, after the first initiation, took over the programming and also running the entire branch in Mülheim area in Germany. So the idea is that not to have participants or academics as lecturers or coordinators, but also take care of the whole branch and organization after a few years of preparation, together with, in collaboration with the institutions we work with at first. Here another image from the Mülheim branch, and here you can see images from the Stockholm branch, which Fahima is the main coordinator. Have been running the branch since also 2013, over a decade. Here are some other lectures, for instance, we just most recently got engaged in upstate New York, Zainab and Jafar. They are actually academics from Afghanistan, and they started in Iran their own alternative school over 8 years, and now they are in upstate New York. Within the academic structure, we were able to organize events with them recently, using and activating the concept of Silent University. So our idea is that no matter where our lecturers are coming from, they can lecture in any language they prefer, in their native languages or their preferred languages, without language limitations, but also legal limitations. So the legal limitations, like the not having necessary documents in order to even involve it with everyday life, basic human rights, but also within an artistic or academic or creative environment. These are usually requirements that put ahead before any action can be taken, any activation can be happening within even culture and arts context. Here you can see another image of Brigitte or Abimbola. These are our lecturers and consultants in multiple cities, from Hamburg, also edition, branch we had. We also made a publication in 2016, which included reports from Athens, from Amman, from multiple branches that, you know, not only portraying this as a kind of like a utopian platform, but rather with all these practical difficulties, you know, like in terms of like from security to racism and, you know, other issues, even within the camps and the cities and institutional structures, that how to create such an institutional organization, you know, in these pre-existing structures, but still independent and their limited principles, with our own principles. So this has been very important for Silent University, that whoever engage with Silent University, no matter if they don't have the documents, no matter if they don't speak the main language, they are able to be paid. And institutions have to become creative rather than people themselves, instead of seeing this as a kind of individual issue, all these obstacles. Rather, it's an institutional limitation, and those institutions, they need to overcome, who are collaborating with Silent University, overcome with their own limitations, have to work with academicians, work with knowledge that has all these diverse bases.
Sorry, Ahmet, I think we might need to wrap up the presentation.
Yeah,
Right,
so
thanks.
I'm about to finish. As I said, it's not easy to put together in a few minutes the 10 years adventure of Silent University in multiple cities. But there are multiple stories. I'm trying to give you some structural information, but with the questions, we will go forward, that how this is, rather than, you know, just bringing some awareness, but something way beyond that kind of approach. And yeah, we can just continue with that. I'm going to skip the next example and save it for the questions as well. Thank you.
So we're going to head to questions to the artists and the speakers. So I think I wanted to begin by paying attention to and honoring the host's thesis for this event, where I think basically the description for our conversation states, quote, "In a society where distraction is the norm, public art may offer a channel for directing attention." But drawing attention, as we talked about, through artworks to something au courant and splashy will often end up drawing attention to the artists, garner arts funding and support from arts institutions. However, you know, my question has always been that, does attention actually create meaningful political change or change bureaucratically, like in visa regimes, for instance, and how we might activate that attention towards meaningful action? So as I've been listening to the two projects that you've spoken about, and which you'll probably I hope we'll speak about some more, I wanted to ask both of you, as two practitioners who work with these very public platforms, and how you thinking about the value of directing attention towards something, or is it that you are really doing this work not necessarily about drawing attention, but to create an engagement that's beyond just bringing attention to something?
It's a complicated question, I think, because I think sometimes you want a lot of attention for something. Yeah. For instance, after I did this project, I was the head of the Public Art Agency Sweden, and there my mission was really to liberate the public art from a very traditional way of looking at art and open it up for relevant artistic practice. And then I wanted to create a lot of attention in the media, in everybody's mind, to reimagine what public art is and how it can be used and so on. But and then in the project I showed, it's so much more about like attention and being attentive and listening to the people who are there. So I think there are so many layers. That's just two of very many examples of attention.
Yeah. Ahmet, what about you?
I want to give a controversial example working with institutions. For instance, something like Silent University is, visibly on the paper also, or at the end of the year when the institutions give a report in link to their fundings and everything like that. It's very very good for the institution to have engagement with Silent University, but not necessarily when it comes to mainstream attention or the main audience profile attention. So usually there are hierarchies between educational departments and exhibition departments of the institutions, and exhibition departments gets the audience and maybe linked to the popular culture, and then education departments actually doing heavyweight work. They don't get the actual attention in terms of from the eyes of the general public. So they get the attention only at the end of within the end year report, not from the main media, and even certain media is only directed to the attention of those. So it could show the institution even rather active. So there are all these makeup projects, can we say education washing projects or community washing projects of a lot of institutions, that there is no sincerity. The only way to collaborate with Silent University, there should be trust and sincerity. There is no other way. There is collaboration, because this is part of the principles of Silent University. If the institution didn't have those principles before engaging with Silent University as a parasitic independent organization, not as a workshop, not as a project, but see it like a serious organization, like a collaborator, same level collaborator, they can even temporarily adapt our principles. That doesn't guarantee that they will continue with our principles as their own principles, but there is no way they can collaborate with Silent University unless they adopt our principles. So it's not just a makeup project. It's not a fake under layer visibility project, but it is actually systematic changing, leading towards systematic changing internally within the institution, or at least show that during that collaboration, at least that institution can do that performance, that treat everyone on equal basis and pay everyone on equal basis, have the equal visibility for everyone behind the doors of the institutions and also within the publicly accessible parts of the institution. So there are a lot of questionable institutional attitudes, especially even within the arts and culture institutions. We really need to make this distinction. Otherwise, everything looks good. So good intention, since with the beginning we say for Silent University, for instance, everybody like in the beginning, also still now, like they love the concept and everything, but this is not enough for the Silent University in order to see that institution as a comrade or a collaborator. So it's very important that institutions are ready to and willing to change. If not, collaboration is not possible. They can always find other projects just for the that first layer only, but we are not there for the first layer. That's why attention is even if it looks like something only to do with general public, it's also highly political. It's not just basic attention economy. It's highly political, and these are all surplus values for the institutions in order to get next year's funding or anything like that. But then they have to do it ethically and principally, based on these ethical principles.
I have so many follow-up questions for both of you. One, Magdalena, I wanted to ask, like, when you say I wanted to liberate public art, I think I know what you mean, but I really wanted to speak more about that. What does that involve? What does that mean?
Yeah, so I will be happy to talk about that. I think attentiveness as a curator is also always being attentive to what artists do and to what is relevant and has agency. And I think, so what I wanted to do, I saw that there was a lot of, how can we say, in public art, it's funded by the 1% rule, so it needs, or historically needed to be permanent. So it fell out of the whole development of contemporary art just by that. And that limited what it was. If we would think about a mural or a sculpture in the middle of a roundabout or something like that. And then we would see what artists actually did in the public space, like Ahmet's work, like a lot of artists. And in that field, there was no funding whatsoever for those projects. And they weren't always taken seriously. They were taking a kind of side project, or not funded at all, just done by heart, by the artist. So I was like, how can we combine, because there's the one historical tradition of publicly funded, well-funded possibilities of making art, but producing rather boring art at that time. And one other tradition, which is artist-run initiatives doing amazing artworks with almost no funding. So what I tried to do was to intersect those traditions and see what happens if we unlock the formats and the possibilities and invite artists to do totally different projects. Not something that we are forcing them to, but looking at their practices and allowing a space for that in the institution. And I think that's how institutions need to work much more in relationship to what you said, Ahmet. How do we understand when we're obsolete, when our structures lock what's possible to do for an artist, or what's possible to do for an institution in terms of curatorial desires or interventions?
Wow, thank you. I love that response, and I love learning about how public art was funded and how that kind of creates a hierarchy that disappears. Artwork that's really relevant and wonderful, engaging work that just doesn't have a funding stream. That's a bureaucratic and kind of legal problem, because that's how things have always been done. And you have to reconceptualize in your legislators' minds what it means to do public art. And that's a huge project. Yeah, we could talk more about how that even happened. So Ahmed, I wanted to follow up by asking, in fact, a bureaucratic question. How is it that, you know, like when my university tries to pay people, even if they are from another country and they have, you know, papers, they're documented in another country, but trying to pay them is a huge bureaucratic nightmare, and it takes hours of work to try to get somebody paid. So unless you're giving away a private you know, thing, an agreement that you make with those institutions about payment, I'm wondering how you got them to agree to pay people equally for work, to recognize them as intellectual people whose work deserves to be compensated.
Yeah, payment is a taboo in the arts. You know, it's not a topic to talk at first, you know, in the first email or at the first beginning of the conversation, which is opposite to what we do. Just to make a connection with Magdalena brilliantly say about public art, you know, it's not a coincidence that, for instance, I'm an artist who is very often nominated for public sculptures, but so far I don't have in full public space a permanent sculpture or a project realized yet. So why artists like me end up in shortlist? Because there are a lot of limitations that therefore maybe looks like health and safety, security limitations, but also actually like, is there how much intention to engage with the community? Because I don't like the concept of static monuments, you know, that are dictating inhabitants without even asking their opinions or involvement. You know, there was at times I myself canceled the project because of the inhabitants were not seeing it relevant, you know. So for me, these dimensions are very important, and also how far an artist can go. So there are often, when a work stays longer, there is more limitations. Now going back to the diplomatic, so bureaucratic limitations. For instance, the images I showed, Zainab and Jafar, we did a presentation in May in Upstate in May, and my payment is not arrived yet. So I heard that the institution pays 8 weeks and plus, so you wait that long, right? But if you think even my own payment, someone who can write nowadays an invoice and, you know, have all these necessary numbers and documents that could be provided, how can you make someone who actually don't have a mailbox address or bank account to be paid? It's easy actually, because from the beginning that is sorted. from the beginning, institution knows that it's part of the concept. When it's part of the concept, it is not just a taboo, it is a creative struggle that we all go through together and be creative together. It's not like institution invite an artist to solve this problem or another problem, and this problem never even discussed, and later it becomes a problem because, you know, the payment never arrives or never made because of these bureaucratic obstacles. But we talk to even sometimes we even Skype with a Zoom call with the accountants of the institution. We don't only talk to the curators, you know, we talk to everyone involved in the institution to understand. We need to talk to the head of security. We need to talk to the accountants. We need to talk to everyone to understand the members of this organization are not just like, they cannot pull out their wallet and show you an ID card to enter the space, you know, they need to be treated kindly because they don't have those basic everyday privileges, you know, in order to access even state institutions or in art institutions, you know. So when they know it's coming, it's actually easier to be prepared than rather postponing and never talking about it, you know, in our precarious art world environments, unless you make lots of money and more commercial direction. I think the problem is not something that is easier to commercialize, but rather, you know, what we can discuss to what extent in terms of ethics principles, you know. So as I said, we go back to the beginning. If the institutions are sincere, these are no problem at all. You know, workers there, sometimes they panic, they don't know, you know, that's an unusual situation, but you just have to take them also serious and talk to them. You know, if they are not also taken serious, they just demand unrealistic bureaucratic papers and things without even knowing why and from whom. You know, they just think creative part is not our concern. Creativity or culture part, we just do here, you know, accounting and all this bureaucratic stuff. So it's very important that also to break the hierarchies between administration, bureaucracy within the institutions and the creative departments and education departments. I'm talking about like really fully breaking the hierarchies. Like institution can only function, there is no hierarchy between its own
Yes, I mean, you know, I think that academic institutions and art institutions often are very resisting towards such kind of challenges, being expected to kind of upturn their understanding of what's quite legal and what's is what they think of, what many bureaucrats think of as what's impossible, and so then it's a no-go. So I would love to kind of learn more about how that process works, especially since you're in upstate New York when working at, there's a branch that or a group that is doing work in upstate New York, and that's where my institution is too. And Magdalena, as a way of kind of jumping off of that, you're the director of a public arts agency in Sweden, and you've mentioned that you had to, quote, totally rebuild the organization in order to go from a traditional public art making projects which engaged in civic society and long-term urban development, and that you created you organized a conference about one of these projects that shows the importance of institutional structures and attention paid by those institutional structures. So I wanted to ask you to speak about your role as the director and how you kind of had to kind of work to change the organizational structure, and about how this symposium addressed some of those common challenges and notions about who has the right to interpret things, and whose agendas and interests and perspectives are important. Seems really important to thinking about whose attention is being paid to what, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, Ahmed. I think exactly that was, I mean, if we talk about attention to details and bureaucratic possibilities, I think that the person who needed to be most creative in the public art agency was the controller. When I could get her to find the right solutions for things, then we had a creative organization. Those people are key, and you have to give them the trust and the inspiration to understand why they want to be creative and make them want to be creative. And that's by absolutely taking away the hierarchies and saying we are a team here and we have to do this together, and without you, nothing works. So I think that was a really, really key thing to make this total change. But it was also, you know, like we had procured curators and the artists. I never saw the artists when we started. So I turned the organization inside out, created an artistic team, invited an architect, and said the main process in this organization is the artistic process. We are a state government state agency. We have to follow the rules, but that's always secondary. We will follow the rules, but that's not why we're here. We are here to do art. So this was like something that we kind of carried together in the end. Took a while, but in the end we did that. Then we did a project which was actually a government mission, where we worked with civic society organizations in what's called the Million Program, but poor neighborhoods in Sweden, basically. And as a state agency, you come and you're called the public state agency. It's very, very difficult. There is a distrust. There is a feeling of total power imbalance. So we and also like who is deciding on what? How do we get a really interesting art project and involve those people? How do we combine that? So we had to work with a very, very meticulous methodology where we made a very easy open call. We went out there, we interviewed them, and we decided for a couple of projects, or 8 or 10 projects. And it wasn't like, what kind of art do you want? It was like, what are your desires? What do you wish for? What are you lacking? So it was more emotional fabric, if you like, in those projects. And then we would select an artist that would actually be able to speak to those needs. And there was never this question, why is this art? Or because it was their needs, and we had selected totally exactly the right person for them. And we also needed people who could maybe also be a mother or something else. So it wasn't just artistic identity, and we all used all our personal capacities as well. And I also made a team which had multiple backgrounds, so that we could kind of meet up those people as close as possible. But when we started the project, I found this amazing quote by the philosopher Marina Garces, and she said, when you enter the scene in public art, you change the scene. And when you do that, you have to be ready to change yourself. So this was our entry point in this whole project. So we understood that we will not know exactly how to do this. We have to change our procedures, our bureaucratic structures, our way of speaking. We have to be adaptable because we are asking these people to change their situation. So I think that kind of humble learning position we wouldn't have been able to do the project without it. It would have failed.
Can you speak a bit about the project itself?
Yes, it was. I mean, the whole idea was. I mean, it's so complicated because it was politically asked for, and in the beginning it was like a special neighborhoods, and then they feel they were pointing those out. So they said neighborhoods with low voter turnout, and then we said, but art is not going to help the voter turnout. It can do other things. So in the end, we said it's in those architectural neighborhoods from the 60s because they are in a phase of renovation. So we kind of made it more concrete rather than having this pointed out as failed places, or we said it's an architectural kind of era that we're looking into. And the whole idea was to I mean, we had already worked in those areas, so it wasn't a new thing, and it was based on this expanded curatorial practice or artistic practice. I think also, and creating a possibility for artists to work in new ways with a very, very high degree of engagement in the project.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
But it could be an association of parents wanting a better place for their kids to play, or it could be anything like that.
Okay. So that's not like in any way traditional kind of forms of what we think of as art or what an art institution will do. But play can be part of like an essential part of how kids get involved in art practice. So, and a lot of those kinds
It wasn't pedagogical. It wasn't like telling people about what art is. It was doing projects, but then with the people who were there, depending on which groups we worked with. So it was tackling real issues in those societies. What is this place? It's filled with drug dealing in the backyard. How can we make a safe place for the kids where we create some kind of hope? So it was, I think it was maybe more using artistic methodologies, and that, of course, a lot of artists are working like that. So it was, but I think if we have attempted to only do sculptures, sometimes there was a need to do a sculpture because it manifested something. But a lot of the time it was totally other projects.
Okay, so both of you have talked about, you know, on the one hand, the limitations of institutions, and on the other hand, the power that institutions have and wield, and the creativity of many people who work in the institutions and would love to kind of employ their creativity to approach challenges and issues such as what you've just talked about. Can you both speak about the kind of both the understanding of an institution as a very powerful, having a very powerful position, as well as kind of what are the limits that you've kind of, you know, run into and bumped your head against?
Yeah, it's important that we don't only just like sit there, criticize institutions, but institutions actually need to come to awareness that they have so much power. So art institutions, especially, they're there for the first place. Like this is the reason they exist, that they are not replicas of slowly functioning other governmental state institutions. They're actually locomotive. They're like, you know, they could be inspiration for the other bureaucratic institutions to come more forward, more open-minded, more, you know, future thinking and so on, and bringing change also. Like if you cannot bring the change through the art and culture institutions, why do we even have them? You know, like where else do we start? You know, so where else should we start? Of course, a lot of people choose to create their own marginal small groups, but then the power is not there. You know, there is a lot of other power of people getting together, and there's a lot of power in that, of course, too. But it's very important to transform the large-scale institutions, and especially if there are art and culture institutions. For me, I always believed in that, but I have always also often heard that institutions, they start the conversation by saying they're limited to symbolical representation, and, you know, this kind of like only awareness, only symbolical gesture, and they verbalize that over and over again, underestimating is actually the power, is the individual's power who is happened to be temporarily in the power position, but it's not institutions' power. Institutions' power, especially culture institutions' power, come from culture heritage, and culture heritage is commonly owned. You don't have to work in that institution. If you're any culture worker, happen to be there, part of the cultural scene from the past, from the future, from the present, you have something to say. You're part of that institutional structure. You know, I'm just thinking of the most traditional versions, which are museums, right? And nowadays I see a lot of biennials, they started with the conception of, you know, going beyond the slow functioning museum, especially Western museum context, but now they are becoming themselves heavier bureaucratic structures, which was not the idea at the very first place when those biennials started. You know, we are into rethink the formats. Okay, is this a liberating format, or is this actually becoming even slower machine? Like sometimes I think contemporary art became so slow that maybe some other art from the history is actually more like future thinking, you know, more, you know, more inspiring something about future. So it's very interesting that how we turn contemporary art into something super like scared of its own shadow, and we need to realize, because there's literally a lot of power in art and culture to change the society. And I've witnessed myself through my micro scale, you know, projects here and there with very limited fundings and things. The miracles has been happening through those over the years. I can imagine what other things can happen when actually people change the conception, especially when they choose to involve with cultural institutions. They should not see that as their own power, individual power, when they are temporarily. This is disillusional, but really celebrate collectively the power of the institution, you know, and teach other institutional, especially the state institution structures, how it could be done better.
Yeah. Magdalena, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's also very interesting to think of it as an institution with power. It's interesting to think about how you can lend power to others, because that's a very efficient thing that you can do. You can give a voice to other people or other organizations, and you can also facilitate for them. That this is really interesting, because I think it's connected to the building. Architecture, someone said, always has a purpose. So you built a house for a reason. So you have an art gallery, and it's the reason to be an art gallery. And I think very often we think that the operation or what we do is the same as the building. The museum is the building. This means that performative works can't be shown, or complex installations can't maybe be shown, or social engaged work can't be shown in the museum rooms. So they are not shown there, then they're not collected, then they're not researched. So we have a wrong writing of history, especially national institutions have this huge problem, which totally affects the writing of art history. If they instead thought they are an organization working with whatever contemporary art might be, whatever form it might have, whatever place it might need, whatever, and then thinking that the building is one of the resources they have, then we would have a totally changed attitude. And I think also when you have a building, this is very interesting, because I've worked mainly without building, but sometimes with building. When you have a building, the attention, you are talking about attention. You want everybody to come to you. Everybody has to come here to us to do this. But when you work without a building, it's very much about facilitating for others. How can we make this possible for other people in other places all over the country? How can we understand them? How can we engage with them? How can we create dialogue with them? And so it's I would say that the foundational attitude of an organization with the building tends to, by itself, create a very egocentric structure. And I think that's why it's hard to be humble. That's why it's hard to be aware of your own power. And that's why it's hard to think that you would facilitate for others. So there might be a lot of other problems, but I think the building is a huge problem, because it says you need to have an audience that can come between 9 and 5 days a week. You can't have something that continues. You can't play with the role of the audiences. So you can't create all the things that artists are experiencing or trying, testing. They don't fit. It's like you have a machine creating round things when really you need all different kinds of forms of them. It's really problematic.
I was, as you were speaking, I was reminded of the South Indian writer Arundhati Roy, who's a novelist and also a political writer, and she had said something that has always stayed, that we know, of course, there's no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. And so I'm thinking about that as we're thinking about who gets to be heard and who doesn't get to be heard, and why, and whether we're the ones with the power to kind of quote give a voice. It's not that they don't have a voice, it's that people are deliberately not given a space to speak, and pushed out of the way. And so that puts the problem squarely not with them as the voiceless, but with those who prevent that speech from happening. Before we go to audience questions, I want to quickly get to ask Ahmet about Bakunin's barricade, because you mentioned you want to speak about it. I'm fascinated by this project. You might have some images that you want to show, and I'd love for you to kind of speak about that, because it is one of the projects that is very esoteric. It is something that changes all the time. it may exist or not, depending on which institution. It doesn't even have to be with an institution, and it has a very practical, real use. And maybe one day it will come to pass. I do know of other places where valuables have been put in front of roads in order to prevent, the police from coming in, etc., or the tanks from coming in. So that's happened in South Africa during student protests. So I know that's actually happened without, ever even planning it. So I'd love for you to speak about this, and then when we can go on to audience questions after that.
Sure, I can keep that very brief because I want to have time also for the audience's questions as well. Important to have maybe show this side of my practice as well. And, again, it was how I can transfer the responsibility from myself to the institution in order to creatively and politically think about the future. And this idea comes from the past. The idea comes from, I'm going to screen share some images, comes from 1849 from Mikhail Bakunin. So according to the story, Bakunin proposed his friends when they are installing barricades in Dresden, maybe they can take some of the original artworks from the National Museum and put in front of the barricade. So Prussian army, when they approach, they might hesitate to destroy the barricade. And then his activist friends find this idea silly. It's actually way too contemporary for his times, and it's interesting thing that barricades were installed at the time by the artists, opera singers, musicians in Dresden back then, and he was a journalist in a local newspaper. So thinking about this idea of like imagining original artworks in times of crisis, an uprising and so on, even in times of war, which is not so far-fetched idea, so it is actually real, and it's also from very nearby. And so museums do change functions in those moments. We have examples. Also, if you think of, Egypt and in Cairo, what happened during Arab uprising, and in many different examples, or very recently, even in Europe, because always whenever I talk about this concept, it's imagined that it is in the safe museum space in Europe, but Europe was the place people were trying to refuge from. Not so long ago, during the Second World War, they were escaping from Europe. This wasn't the safe place. So the safe place is changing, and now we can see it with the war in, war against Ukraine. That you can see that it's like it can happen also in that part of the world, that the museums suddenly need to turn into shelters and either hide the original artworks in caves or secret places, or use them as a shields. So I come up with this proposal, imagining, okay, at that moment it felt very safe when I did it in Holland, in Netherlands. For instance, this is the latest edition. It was in Ohio when we installed this at this very, very leftist university at Oberlin College, which is very much next to mostly right-wing cities, towns in US. And in Akron, just like 1 hour away from this installation, there was upside down burning police cars that summer, last summer, basically, because of police shootings. So you can imagine that these things are not just like some fantasy of an artist coming from a fictional world, it's so real. And this was understood when I was doing different versions of it in different museums. Finally, at Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, this version that became part of the institution's collection suddenly. Of course, it took us time to talk to everyone working in the institution to understand what is this thing about. It is not just visual celebration of this kind of street violence and so on, but actually, like, if this work becomes part of the museum collection, which is now at Stedelijk Museum, so no one can blame this work to be just a proposal anymore. After the 5th editions, it became an artwork as part of the collection. When there is an uprising in the future, the museum had to sign up this conceptual contract, which says under the specific conditions, specific kind of uprisings that we defined together with the museum lawyers, this work needs to be loaned back to the streets, and they need to also discuss, they need to negotiate to loan back the original works with it. So, and this is already a signed contract. So I'm happy to answer questions about it. I'm trying to explain very, very fast. But whole idea in the beginning, and a lot of people thought I'm just fantasizing, was to arrive to that moment that actually responsibility is transferred to the museum. It's not just my exceptional, unusual idea that is not going to be real, but this work is dynamic. It's any moment to be performed on the streets, and it can happen any moment. You know, so it is as real as it can get. And also it creates a lot of like bureaucratic discussion, you know, a lot of other discussions within, you know, the limits of the art institutional practices or artistic practices between public space and institutional space, white cube space.
Super. So I'm hearing that it's time for us to go to audience questions. So let's move on, and please ask your questions.
Nilika, I believe they are available on the Q&A. So you
Oh.
see them at the bottom of your screen.
Yes, I do. So many wonderful compliments to to the both of you. So one of the questions, have you ever encountered, Nico asks, could you recommend works that encourage audiences to become aware of the importance of their attention or distraction and of the economies that rely on them, like the attention economy? I think there's been a lot of conversation among my students, my housemates, about that term, the attention economy, especially because of social media. And so do either of you have projects that kind of focus on about attention and distraction?
Well, I had a literal project focusing on that, but it's not, it doesn't happen yet. So I will not explain that one. It's really playing with the idea of like immaterial labor of the audience and material labor happening in the museum by the museum staff. But I will explain that when the project actually happens after that. Example to attention economy, I see some of the institutions now, they go to, you know, almost like they see maybe a person and maybe younger artist or young cultural worker who is very active or very visible in social media. They start inviting those to their institutions because most institutions don't know how to use their own social media. So by getting involved, you know, lesser known or younger artists who have bigger audience online than the museums, they try to attract those to their own institutional social media space, which is for me kind of like a little bit revolutionary reverse situation, but it's not deep, you know. It's still based on the attention economy. It's still based on this short moment of like museums and institutions being paralyzed. So it became so obvious after COVID, you know, when everything became online, suddenly all the exhibitions, they realized, okay, this tools needs to be developed, you know, they needs to be better organized, and they need to have like hire better people or who knows actually what they are doing in order to represent institutions in those spaces. For me, it's very important that hybrid practices are not excluding one another. You know, it's very important to see what kind of audiences could be reached, and they know, they're aware of, you know, we don't think about, like, for instance, influencers. They're aware of every post they do, everything they do. They capitalize that already since long time, but that is not still about the context. And it is similar to different versions of the art world. You know, context should be relevant in terms of, you know, as to be considered as cultural value beyond attention economies, you know, online or offline. So this cultural value, cultural heritage is collectively owned. So any member of audience is taking part in that. And every time you step in a museum or going into an art institution, even paying for it, everyone should be aware of the contribution they are doing. It is not a thing to be underestimated.
I
would you
can't really think of an example of that, but something relating to it. There is a landscape architect called Robin Winogrand, a woman who works mainly in Switzerland, and she talks about embodiment, creating embodied experiences for the people in a park. And she also talks about how landscape or the space between the houses don't have a specific purpose, so they are good spaces for imagination. But she talks also about the resistance, though. So if you create stepping stones, for instance, you have to pay attention to your steps, and you get grounded. And then she plays with the size of them and so on. And I think there are a lot of artists and architects and landscapes, maybe specifically our landscape architects, who create experiences also in the urban space or in landscapes that kind of are a response to the media situation, but they are not a political comment on that attention economy, but they counter it, and they create alternative spaces of shifting your focus. And I like this idea of resistance, how by creating you need to be attentive to something else, to your body, to the nature, to whatever is around you. So that's another strategy that's not like spot on facing exactly what you're doing, but creating an alternative kind of attention, taking you away from the distraction.
Yeah, even the project that you spoke about, Chopin's Heart, is one which redirects your attention to you, the very being that you are, and your presence and your needs. And suddenly you realize you would like to sit and have a sangria, you would like to be tucked in, and it returns you to an attentiveness that you probably were very distracted from. Actually, I'm now thinking of a lot of artwork like that brings you to a mindfulness. That's very beautiful. I think that's what drew me to art in the first place, was that it created a sense of presencing in myself first that allowed me to attend to the world as well. Because without being present in myself, I wasn't really able to attend to anything else in a way that was like fully recognizant of another person's being. So one of the another person asked another question, is that whose attention do you most seek through to pursue through your work? For both of you, is it policymakers, communities, or institutions? I would add, like, it's really all of them, isn't it?
Depends on the context, I think. So sometimes and also I'm thinking about attention and how to redirect attention. I think that's a super, super interesting question, especially when you work with politicians, which I do much more now than I used to. So it's like you have a project in the city, or you have resources in politics, in decision making, and how can you redirect the attention? So they want to do something, and it's not such a good project, and it's not going to create a better environment in the city. So how can you kind of understand what they're looking for and what they want, and then shift their attention and show them something that would work much better? So I'm super I'm very, very now interested in renegotiating and redirecting attention, and that would be on a political level. Or for someone also had a question about funding and how you create better funding, and we started an organization to advocate for visual arts organizations, basically for better conditions, which never existed in Sweden. So the visual arts, being a very individualistic field, is way behind the performing arts, for instance. So here we talk about how institutions need to have the budgets to pay artists and so on. And there, of course, it's really the attention of policymakers and bureaucrats and politicians to make them understand why art is important. I think that's the key issue. And then it's then you really, and this is almost like working with an artist as a curator, because you have to be super interested in what their driving forces are. And you have to really, really listen attentively, because then you might understand where there is a crack or where an argument would fit within their world. But so I mean, for me, it's gone for being very attentive with the audience and the artists, working very, very closely, to now working much more on structural, big scale levels of renegotiating with the political. And then sometimes you want the attention, and sometimes you want to work very secretly or very to have that second step of creating attention if it's not reached. So it's a lot of different stages, I think, when you negotiate in what do you want to be public and when and in which order. What is the synchronization of that in order to achieve those negotiations that you want?
Yeah, thank you, Magdalena. And I try to summarize some perspective from the way I work. You know, I pay the attention to people who expect my attention the least. So I don't, for instance, as part of my practice, I never took it as ethical to only talk to people who are useful to me, you know, that kind of like networking approaches and things like that. I think that's very short-term thinking, you know, although it's somehow working in the art world. I always told myself, how can, if I'm talking about the art world from the instituting practice way, critically like this, how can I be not like behave like the art world, you know, the way it operates. So I start with my friend circles, you know, my immediate circles, like, is it diverse enough? Is it mixed enough? Is it in terms of background, you know, all kinds of things. And this is one thing. So it's very important to start with your own microenvironment and also paying attention to the people who don't even expect you will have time for them, you know, so then this really returns much bigger way in the long run. So it's not a short way or short-term thinking. Yeah, this is one important thing. Yeah, I had one more point, but I will come back to that later.
We are being asked to wrap up a bit and
Okay, yeah.
close up. But I do know that several of the questions did focus on, you know, have you gone to this institution and tried to speak to them and about funding? And so I'm glad you addressed it, because somebody did ask, like, did you go to the Tate and other partners with the idea of the Silent University, or did it come from responding to a brief or an invitation? Can you talk about the—
It was an invitation. Yeah, it was an invitation for a residency program that was limited to 1 year residency. But when I had this idea, I told them this is beyond the residency program. This is beyond me being the artist doing the program. So we have 1 year contract, but it will go beyond. And now it's more than 10 years. You know, so they try to figure out the way to stay with collaborate with the idea, you know, beyond that 1 year. And they tried, you know, they tried to figure out ways, and some other institutions manage, you know, Delfino Foundation managed, so they continued at least 3-4 years further. Even later we collaborated, you know, some institutions were able to transform themselves even that very first moment. So with Silent University, actually the funding, I knew it was never going to be enough to apply, even do the crowdfunding things, like everything would be only one time. And any one-time thing wouldn't have anything last for 10 years, a decade, and still be ongoing, you know. So every branch had to figure out a way from the very beginning how it can survive beyond its directors, creators, very first people beyond me, you know. So it doesn't continue because I have so much like energy to try to keep it up and all this thing. There's always more and more motivated people, and they now come, they come with the shared responsibility. They know that they have to figure out a way that how, you know, it doesn't have to grow in a scale. We don't look for architecture or buildings like Magdalena says, you know, these are how institutions institutionalize themselves, but also as a name, as a concept, you can be very strong, you know. So this concept became strong enough internationally for each branch to collaborate time to time, but also locally find a way to, you know, exist beyond the very first creators and institutions, because institutions may stay there, might also disappear, but people change all the time, so they don't always stay there. If the concept is not strong enough, it wouldn't stay this long, you know. So I'm happy to see that at least partly in collaboration with the art institutions, this is possible. So it is a kind of proof that there are many other things can be done this way.
Thanks so much. Unless you have anything to add, we're going to conclude our conversation, and I'll let Elizabeth take us out.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nilika, Magdalena, and Ahmet for the comments and the questions that you raised. Is raising awareness through art enough? How do we activate that awareness? How can institutions lend power or attention to others? And also, how do we celebrate collectively the power of institutions? I'm sure there's a lot for us to continue to reflect on. I also wanted to thank Lizzie Wharton, our BSL interpreter, for this event. And thank you so much to our audience for attending and asking pertinent and interesting questions. We really want to listen and build on your feedback for future events. So my colleague Jack has just added a link in the chat. So once you exit Zoom, you will automatically be redirected to a survey. And we would be really grateful if you could take a few minutes to complete. We will also upload a recording of today's event on YouTube that will also include captions and BSL interpretation. So head over to our website or to YouTube to find it in the coming days. And also, as you saw on the slides at the beginning of the event, we are endeavoring to keep the Constellations program free for participants and event attendees. So if you are able, we would really appreciate a donation to ensure we can continue to keep the program free. You should be able to see a link to donate in the Zoom chat very briefly, and you can scan the QR code on the screen. Thank you. And finally, another huge thank you to our amazing speakers, to the Arts Council England, Barrington Hibbett Associates, our Constellations patrons and UP supporters for supporting this program, to our partners Flattime House and Liverpool Biennial, and to everyone at UP Project who has worked on this event and on the program as a whole. Thank you so much.